Yeah, my name's Adam Pugh. I work for Cycling UK, which is a nationwide cycle charity, and it exists simply to get more people cycling, to get more people on bikes, and to remove the barriers that stop people cycling in the first place. They could be social, they could be cultural, they could be infrastructural, they could be financial. So we can't deal with all those at once, and we're not the only charity that works in this way. Certainly with infrastructure, Sustrans is key to improving cycle infrastructure. And I would say us and Sustrans both lobby the government, so it's partly about lobbying for better provision for cycling. But certainly with the social, cultural and financial barriers to cycling, that's where we really come in. And my job exists to run two programmes. One is called the Big Bike Revival, which is about getting more people back on their bikes. So for whatever reason, if people have never cycled before, or they have a bike languishing in the garage that they've never used for years and it's rusty, it's about thinking about, well, how can we get them back on that bike? So very simply, it's about fixing people's bikes up for free. We've got an army of mechanics around the country currently delivering free so-called Dr. Bike sessions, which is a simple mechanical check and a sort of free service just to get people's bikes back in tip-top condition. The other programme is the Community Cycle Club programme, and that's more about the social side of cycling, about addressing social and cultural barriers maybe to cycling, thinking about why people haven't been able to enjoy cycling before. So it's thinking about many of the same things, maybe provision of cycles in their bikes in the first place, but also thinking about perceived danger. Why don't people go out? Well, often because the roads are really dangerous. So it's about trying to create safe, enjoyable kind of clubs based in the community, often working with existing community organisations to create an opportunity for people to come together at all levels. So from people who can't ride at all to learn to ride, through to people who are quite keen and quite confident and want to progress further and want to go out on a social ride every week or month or whatever it is. Also about learning to fix bikes, because once you learn to fix a bike, you realise you've got a power. You have a power to fix other things as well, and that's really a great feeling. But obviously for the bike itself, if you can fix your own bike, you can go out on your bike, you can carry on doing it forever. So for me, it's about enabling and empowering people to get back on their bikes and then to continue using their bikes. But it's certainly not about bikes as bikes. It's about cycling as a social phenomenon. Really, it's about getting people together to enjoy riding. It's just about cycling for pleasure as much as it's about cycling for commuting. It's not about cycling for sport in the same way as say an organisation like British Cycling is about performance and sport. It's not so much about that. Well, at any one time there's upwards of 10 organisations delivering these free Dr. Bike sessions in and around the area. I only started my job in October, and there were already several delivering across the city. But one problem was there wasn't provision over at the coast, and there wasn't provision really sort of throughout the city. There were several gaps, so I've worked to try to plug those gaps. There are currently over 15 organisations, and some of those are community organisations, some of them are sole trader bike mechanics, some of them are bike shops, CIC bike shops. We don't tend to work with, well, we don't at all work with chain shops. That's not the point. It's about being in the community, working with people who already have access to and can contact people in their communities. So it's really been down at a grassroots level. We have several new organisations joining us over the next few weeks. There's one over in Whitley Bay, which is really great. We've had no provision over there at all, I don't think, for the last year or so. And Star and Shadow, I'm really pleased about, over in Shieldfield and Heaton, will be delivering sessions, as you know, mainly to the communities are very local to the Star and Shadow, but also with a focus on kids' bikes, which I think is really great, because especially now in lockdown, I think kids are suffering more than most at not being able to get out and play and meet their friends. And if there are any other barriers to that, such as broken bikes, and we know that kids' bikes are often the bikes that suffer the most, partly because kids treat them, they ride them to destruction. So it's really great to be able to offer that kind of service. There are also some new clubs that will be coming along soon, but they won't really probably be up and running until spring, and certainly not until lockdown eases. There'll be many more opportunities as we go into spring and summer for people to be able to just find out about local little rides that they can join in with, and opportunities to learn about fixing their bike as well. The idea will be that everything's joined up. I mean, this is a problem UK-wide. It's gaps of provision. It's the classic kind of metre-wide cycleway that suddenly just deposits you back on a road and has done more harm than good, really, because you get spat back into a lane of traffic. And there are several schemes in Newcastle that are really fantastic, such as the scheme in the city centre, John Dobson Street, across here on the City Stadium, along the quayside. I mean, that's been there for years, but these are great. It's just where they don't join up, there's a problem, and I think the City Council knows about this. It's just, it needs investment. It also needs political support, and that, for me, is a really big one. And we've seen recently, over at North Tyneside, an amazing cycleway, and we've seen what can happen, given the will, given the political will, and the ability to make a change quickly as an emergency measure during coronavirus. We've seen what is possible, and it doesn't take a lot of money, about taking back some of the carriageway from cars, basically, with the Sunrise Cycleway over at the coast, which went from Tynemouth all the way up to Whitley Bay, and was really amazing. It was taken down really because of vocal opposition from the car lobby. I'm really hopeful that it might be reinstated at some point, and it would become a permanent addition, because nowhere more than there, I think, recently, locally, has there been such a need demonstrated. It's so busy there at the coast. It's so unnecessary to have 2 lanes of traffic there. So I think that kind of political will really is the driving force, because there are all sorts of things. It's not just about spending millions of pounds on new tarmac that costs a fortune, because we can't do that overnight. But where you can put wands in the street very, very cheaply, you can also alter the timing of traffic lights to suddenly give more priority to cyclists and pedestrians. You can change that overnight. I think one of the really exciting things that's happening both here and nationally at the moment is low traffic neighbourhoods. The implementation of so-called modal filters, where streets are closed off experimentally to begin with, but we hope it will become permanent. And here in Newcastle, one of the kind of hot spots of that at the moment, and I say hot spots both because it's a good thing, I think, but also because it's been subject to vocal opposition, is the closure of 4 bridges locally, which have been fantastic. They're up for renewal now, or dismissal, and so I think we're all waiting to see what happens with that. There's a great organisation in Newcastle called the Newcastle Cycling Campaign, which is a great advocate for making these changes and for holding politicians to account. So I mean, I'd just like to see more of the same. I'd like to see more joined up schemes. Grey Street in the middle of the city centre is due to be made permanent, as far as I'm aware, and that will be great. But I mean, that's just one stretch of road, and there's always the worry that that councils, and this is by no means peculiar to Newcastle, but that councils will spend money on the kind of showpiece bits of road, but it's the forgotten commuter or work or school runs in estates, suburbs around the city that really need the investment, because that's where people are doing kind of invisible cycling, utility cycling, and that's what I'm passionate about, is cycling for utility, because that's when you can really make a difference, when it's just part of people's lives and they don't even realise that they're a cyclist. You know, when you don't call yourself a cyclist, perhaps, maybe that's what we should aim for, is that when bikes are just an extension of people's lives. I think if you go to Amsterdam or any of these big cycling cities, people won't call themselves a cyclist, they'll just hop on their bike, because it's just how you get to work or take the kids to school. That's brilliant for me. What we've realised, I think, over the years is that what we need is proper segregated cycle infrastructure. It can't just be a bit of paint on a road. People don't feel safe enough. And what's been shown time and time again is that if you build decent infrastructure, people will start using it. But it needs to be joined up, and we can't rely on that alone. Actually, it has to be about education. It has to be about reducing traffic at the same time. So it can't just be about making even very good segregated cycle lanes and expecting car use to be able to just rising exponentially. We have to tackle that at the same time. But I think one key to it is decent segregated cycle infrastructure, such as we've got here in the city, and it's growing with its own traffic lights, its own lanes, actually physically separated from the road. So in terms of best practice, I guess what we've seen happen in London with cycle superhighways is interesting, because it shows that not exactly you build it and they will come, but kind of almost. If you build decent, then you see all sorts of people who wouldn't otherwise have ventured out onto the roads will come and use it. What bugs me is that the spend in London on all sorts of things, including cycle infrastructure, but also public transport, is so disproportionate to what we get, especially here in the northeast, that we're sort of radically underfunded. Well, it all depends on how much investment is made in it, and I think what's been shown in the past with kind of arguably one of the UK's first, or perhaps still only, I don't know, sort of cycling cities, Cambridge, where cycling really sort of has taken off as a result of investment in infrastructure. I seem to remember reading once that it took a particular tipping point, a particular percentage of people that were visibly cycling and were doing it every day. It took that tipping point to then take things over into a commitment which was going to be long term and not just sort of piecemeal and short term. So I think what happened in Cambridge is that it got to that point and people could no longer ignore it. The city council could no longer ignore this groundswell of cycling, so they had to then take more notice of it. I think it's about reaching a critical mass of people, but I think you're not going to do that through infrastructure alone. It's going to be through education, as I said. It's going to be through reduction in car use, just making it, unfortunately, more painful for people to use the cars for non-essential trips. And I think it's also about looking at current arguments and trying to assess them in terms of how logical they are. So electric vehicles, of course they're great in terms of not polluting at source. Of course we want city centres that are not full of diesel belching lorries and cars. But at the same time, an electric car is still a car, and electricity still has to be produced somewhere. And this is something I find I get stunned silence for when I mention it to people. But you know, in a way, all it does is offset how you're producing electricity, where you're producing electricity, and like as not, that electricity, if it still comes from a coal-fired power station, is coming from is very class-based. You know, there aren't any coal-fired power stations in Kensington and Chelsea. So there is still a massive problem, and just because electric vehicles are the future in terms of emissions at source, I still don't think they're the future for mass transit. I think people, in cities at least, need to get used to the fact that if they're able, they need to walk, they need to cycle, they need to use public transport, and we need to invest in those things. But they won't do it unless there's decent investment. You know, trying to convince someone to go out to do their shopping, well, they used to do it in the car. Especially on a wet Tuesday evening in February, you have to give them some inducement, and that's what's missing at the moment. Or at least you have to then make it slightly more painful for them to do it in their car. And you don't do that by building massive car parks around every supermarket, making the roads busier and busier and busier, and not providing a decent cycle infrastructure. Cargo bikes are the future, and I'm surprised that we're not seeing more of them, really, especially here in Newcastle. There's a company here in Newcastle.
Explain for the uninitiated.
Cargo bike. Cargo bike effectively is a bike you can carry cargo on. So there are many different versions. I mean, you can sort of domestically, you could have a relatively small one, a sort of so-called long-tail bike with a long back to it, which you can fit more panniers than you normally could to do your weekly shopping. Through to, in the middle somewhere, a long bike with a box in the front. I used to have one. I used to put my 3 boys in it and take them to school.
The butcher's bike.
Yeah, brilliant. And it had 2 benches and they'd sit in there. It was very heavy. Didn't have any, it was before e-assist was really a thing. Through to a massive box, you know, it can carry 200 kilos. And if there's an amazing company in London called Pedal Me, who have taken this really to an art form and are carrying not only a huge amount of cargo in the front on their purpose-built box on the bike, but also huge trailers. And they're carrying people as well. So they're providing almost a taxi service, which during lockdown has enabled them to keep going, where they kind of lost their business really effectively overnight, where no one needed them anymore to transport cargo. They switched to carrying people and found that they were able to stay afloat, and now they're back to doing cargo as well. But cargo bikes, especially for things like the sort of philosophy of things like last mile delivery, which is going to become a thing, I hope, here as well when the clean air zone comes into operation. Lorries won't be able to come over the Tyne Bridge without paying handsomely anymore, and so they're going to have to make alternative arrangements, we hope, if this is done in the right way. The idea is that deliveries would be made to out-of-town hubs, and then those last mile or last few miles deliveries would be made by electric vehicles and cargo bikes. Electric bikes are great because they've enabled access to so many more people, and I think if it allows more people to cycle, then it's got to be a good thing. So for people who are either infirm or had joint problems, for instance, or were older or were recuperating, perhaps, or people who are just less confident about being able to keep up enough speed not to wobble on the road or whatever, I imagine, then this fills a gap, and especially, I suppose, for some people it might be a gateway then to eventually going to a pedal bike. For some people it's the reverse. Perhaps they've cycled happily all their life and they're now older, they just need a bit of help. Then brilliant, and I think it's a good idea. I mean, of course there's the issue about the sort of relative sustainability of it, but I think sort of in the grand scheme of things it's very small. I think the help massively outweighs any negative.
Yeah, if you compare the footprint of an electric bicycle to a Range Rover Evoque, then you're talking about a different ballpark altogether. Really,
yeah,
so.
And the ability to run over children is massively different as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Although I have seen some quite dangerously fast electric vehicles flying down here.
I think there's a big that is the key. That's an interesting point. I think there's a lot of unregulated. I think because it's so new, there seem to be some that are definitely not working on the e-assist model. They're working on the take you as fast as you can model, and they're basically like electric motorbikes. And I think that's kind of problematic.
That's a coming conflict.
Yeah, it's the same with e-scooters. So. I mean, where are they road vehicles? Are they not road vehicles?
Yeah,
so it needs to be ironed out.
Well, on that, I think we should probably call it really. But thank you very much, Adam. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.